This 1862 photographer's portrait looks routine until you notice the rope fibers. It seemed like nothing more than Confederate military portraiture at first glance. A proud officer, a fine horse, a wartime keepsake meant for family back home. But one detail, barely visible along the animal's flank, would lead an archivist down a path she never expected. What she found would rewrite the story of an entire county's so-called law enforcement during the Civil War. Renee Caldwell had been working in the conservation department of a university archive in Jackson, Mississippi for 11 years. She specialized in 19th century photographic materials, the fragile ambrotypes and tintypes and album and prints that survived floods in attics and estate sales only to end up in acid-free folders waiting to be cataloged. Most days, the work was quiet. She cleaned emulsions, stabilized cracked glass plates, and wrote careful condition reports. The photos themselves were usually unremarkable. Soldiers in stiff poses, children in christening gowns, families arranged on porches. The photograph that changed everything arrived in a donation from a family in Yalobusha County. The donor's grandmother had died, and her house had yielded several boxes of old paper, most of it worthless. But tucked between a stack of receipts and a water-damaged Bible was a single image mounted on a thick card. The photograph showed a man in a gray Confederate uniform standing beside a dark horse. The man's posture was confident, one hand resting on the animal's neck, the other tucked into his belt near a holstered revolver. Behind them, a split-rail fence and a blur of trees suggested the edge of a farm or plantation. The light was good. The composition was careful. It was, in every obvious respect, a typical portrait of a Confederate cavalry officer, probably taken in the spring or summer of 1862, based on the uniform details in the photographic format. Renee placed the image under her magnifying lamp and began her usual inspection. She noted the surface abrasions, the slight foxing along the lower edge, the photographer's stamp on the reverse. J. Mosby, Coffeyville, Miss. She was about to set it aside and move to the next item when something caught her eye. Along the horse's right flank, near the saddle blanket, there was a smear of something pale against the dark coat. At first, she thought it was damage to the emulsion, a chemical bloom or a water stain. But when she adjusted the angle of the light, she saw that the marks were not on the surface of the photograph. They were in the photograph. They were part of the original image. She increased the magnification. The pale marks resolved into individual strands, fibers. They clung to the horse's coat in a ragged line, as though something had been dragged alongside the animal and left traces behind. The fibers were coarse, uneven, the kind of texture you would see in hemp rope, and there was a faint discoloration beneath them, darker than the surrounding coat. It looked like dried residue. It looked like blood. Renee sat back in her chair. She had seen thousands of Civil War photographs. She had never seen anything like this. She picked up the image again and studied the officer's face. He was looking directly at the camera, chin lifted, expression calm, proud even. Whatever had happened before this portrait was taken, whatever had left those fibers on his horse, he did not seem troubled by it. She turned the photograph over. Beneath the studio stamp, someone had written in faded pencil, "Captain E.R. Hargrave, returned 7 this month." 7 what? Returned from where? Renee set the photograph on her desk and stared at it for a long time. She knew she could simply catalog it, file it away, move on. But she also knew that she would not be able to forget those fibers. Something in this image was wrong, and she had a feeling that finding out what it was would mean uncovering something that had been buried for a very long time. Renee Caldwell had come to archival work through a winding path. She had grown up in Natchez, surrounded by the grand antebellum homes that tourists loved to photograph. As a child, she had been fascinated by the stories those houses told, but even then, she had sensed that the stories were incomplete. The docents talked about architecture and furnishings and the families who had built their fortunes there. They rarely talked about the people who had actually done the building. She had studied history in college, then library science in graduate school, and had found her way to conservation work almost by accident. But she had never lost that early instinct, that sense that the official record was always missing something. In her years at the archive, she had handled portraits of enslavers and portraits of the enslaved. She had seen the formal studio shots that wealthy white families commissioned, and she had seen the rare, painful images of black people posed as property, photographed for sale notices or insurance claims. She knew how photographs could lie. She knew how a carefully composed image could make brutality look like order, exploitation look like care, ownership look like family. But she had never seen evidence of violence captured so inadvertently, so carelessly, as those rope fibers on Captain Hargrave's horse. She began her research the way she always did, with the basics. She searched for J. Mosby in the standard directories of 19th-century photographers and found a brief entry. James Mosby had operated a small portrait studio in Coffeyville, Mississippi, from 1859 to 1864. He had advertised his services in local newspapers, offering ambrotypes and cartes de visite at reasonable prices. There was nothing unusual about him. He was one of hundreds of itinerant and semi-permanent photographers who had worked across the South during the war years, capturing soldiers before they left for battle and sometimes after they returned. Next, she turned to the name on the back of the photograph, Captain E.R. Hargrave. She found him in the muster rolls of the 2nd Mississippi Cavalry, a unit that had spent most of the war operating in northern Mississippi. Elias Robert Hargrave had enlisted in April 1861, received his captain's commission in early 1862, and served until he was wounded at Bryce's Crossroads in 1864. After the war, he had returned to Yalobusha County, where census records showed him living on a farm with his wife and 3 children. He had died in 1891 and was buried in the county cemetery. His obituary, which Renee found in a digitized newspaper archive, described him as a gallant soldier and respected citizen. None of this explained the rope fibers. None of this explained the note on the back of the photograph. Returned 7 this month. 7 what? Renee reached out to a colleague at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, a historian named Marcus Webb who specialized in Civil War-era Mississippi. She sent him a high-resolution scan of the photograph and asked if he had any ideas. Marcus called her back the next day. His voice was careful. "Where did you get this?" Renee explained the donation. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think you need to look at the county records, specifically the sheriff's office records from 1862. If this is what I think it is, those fibers are not from any ordinary rope." Renee asked what he meant. Marcus hesitated. "There was a practice," he said, "during the war years, especially in counties where the white population was outnumbered by the enslaved population. Local officials would pay bounties to men who captured and returned people who had escaped. The preferred method was to chase them down on horseback and drag them back. The rope marks, the injuries, those were considered acceptable. The point was to make an example." Renee felt her stomach turn. She looked at the photograph again, the officer's calm expression, the horse's dark flank, the pale fibers clinging to the coat. "You think this Captain Hargrave was a slave catcher?" "I think," Marcus said, "that if you look at the county records, you might find that Captain Hargrave was a very busy man. The Yalobusha County Courthouse had burned twice, once during the war and once in the 1920s. But fragments of the antebellum and wartime records had survived, scattered across various repositories. Renee spent the next 3 weeks tracking them down. She found partial sheriff's office ledgers in a state archive in Jackson. She found plantation account books in a private collection at a historical society in Oxford. She found church records, estate inventories, and newspaper clippings that mentioned the Hargrave family by name. What she found confirmed Marcus Webb's suspicion and went far beyond it. The sheriff's office ledgers contained a category of payments that Renee had never seen before. They were listed under the heading Returns and recorded. Payments made to individuals for apprehending and delivering named persons. The amounts varied, usually between $10 and $50, depending on the distance traveled and the condition of the person returned. The names of the captured were almost always first names only. Sam, property of J. Whitfield. Lucy, property of T. Moss. Daniel, property of E.R. Hargrave. Elias Hargrave appeared in these ledgers not as a claimant seeking the return of his own enslaved people, but as a payee. He was receiving bounties for capturing and returning people who had escaped from other plantations. Between January and August of 1862, his name appeared 7 times, 7 returns in 8 months. Each entry noted the date, the name of the captured person, the name of the enslaver to whom they were returned, and the amount paid. Renee cross-referenced the dates with the inscription on the back of the photograph. Returned 7 this month. The photograph had been taken in August 1862. The ledger showed that Hargrave had been paid for his 7th return on August 14, 1862. The timing matched, but there was something else in the ledgers that troubled her even more. Next to several of the entries was a handwritten notation: "No arrest warrant filed." In antebellum Mississippi, capturing an escaped enslaved person was legal, but it was supposed to involve certain procedures. The captor was supposed to file a report with the sheriff, and the enslaver was supposed to provide proof of ownership before the person could be returned. These notations suggested that those procedures had been skipped. Hargrave had been paid, but no official record of the captures had been made. Renee called Marcus Webb again. Why would they skip the paperwork? Marcus sighed. Because the paperwork would have shown what actually happened. If a person was injured during the capture, if they died, if they were beaten so badly they could not work for weeks afterward, that would all have to be documented. But if there is no arrest warrant, there is no record. The enslaver gets their property back, the catcher gets his money, and no one has to answer any uncomfortable questions. So the county was helping them cover it up. The county was running the operation, Marcus said. The sheriff's office was not just looking the other way. They were coordinating it. They were paying the bounties out of county funds. This was not rogue behavior. This was policy. Renee went back to the plantation account books and found more evidence of the system at work. Enslavers in Yalobusha County kept detailed records of their human property, including purchase prices, skills, and what they called disposition. Several of these ledgers contained entries that mentioned Captain Hargrave by name. Sam returned by ERH, condition poor, 3 weeks recovery. Lucy returned by ERH, deceased in transit, no refund claimed. Deceased in transit. Renee read the phrase 3 times. Lucy had been captured by Hargrave, dragged back toward the plantation, and had died before she arrived. And the enslaver had noted this in his account book as casually as he would note a crop loss or a broken plow. She found one more document that made the system undeniable. It was a letter from the Yalobusha County Sheriff to a neighboring county official dated June 1862. The sheriff was explaining the return system and offering to share information about successful techniques. Captain Hargrave has proven most effective, the sheriff wrote. His method is to pursue on horseback and use a long rope to secure the fugitive. This allows for rapid return with minimal delay. Some damage to the property is unavoidable, but the deterrent effect is considerable. Minimal delay, some damage. The language was clinical, bureaucratic. But Renee knew what it meant. She knew what those rope fibers on the horse's flank represented. They were not just evidence of one capture. They were evidence of a system, a coordinated effort by local government and Confederate military officers to terrorize enslaved people into submission, to make escape so dangerous and so brutal that no one would dare to try. And Captain Hargrave had posed for his portrait with the evidence still visible, as though it were a badge of honor. Renee brought her findings to the archives director, a careful administrator named Dr. Patricia Simmons. She laid out the photograph, the ledger entries, the account books, and the sheriff's letter. She explained what the rope fibers meant. She argued that this image should not simply be cataloged and filed away. It should be the centerpiece of an exhibition, a chance to show visitors how ordinary-looking photographs could hide extraordinary violence. Dr. Simmons listened without interrupting. When Renee finished, the director was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "This is going to be controversial." Renee had expected this. She had prepared for it. The evidence is solid. Marcus Webb has reviewed everything. The documents are authentic. "I do not doubt the evidence," Dr. Simmons said. "But you are asking us to take a photograph that was donated by a local family and use it to accuse their ancestor of what amounts to murder. You are asking us to implicate the county government, the sheriff's office, in a coordinated system of terror. There are descendants of these people still living in this state. There are donors to this university whose families were part of this history." That is exactly why it matters, Renee said. These families have been telling a story about their ancestors for generations, gallant soldiers, respected citizens. But that story erases the people who were hunted and beaten and killed. It erases Lucy. It erases Sam and Daniel and all the others whose names are in these ledgers. If we have the evidence to tell the truth, do we not have an obligation to do it? Dr. Simmons did not answer immediately. She picked up the photograph and studied it. The officer's proud posture, the horse's dark flank, the pale fibers. "I will need to take this to the board," she said finally. "This is not a decision I can make alone." The board meeting took place 3 weeks later. Renee was invited to present her findings, along with Marcus Webb, who had agreed to serve as an outside expert. The room was full. Several board members had brought their own advisors. A representative from the university's communications office sat in the corner, taking notes. Renee walked the board through the evidence step by step. She showed them the photograph, the ledger entries, the account books, the sheriff's letter. She explained the system of paid slave catching that had operated in Yalobusha County during the war. She described what the rope fibers meant, what had happened to the people whose names appeared in the records. When she finished, the questions began. One board member, a retired attorney, asked whether the documents could be interpreted differently. Is it possible that these returns were legitimate law enforcement, capturing criminals, for example? Marcus Webb answered. The ledgers are explicit. They name the captured individuals as property. They name the enslavers to whom they were returned. There is no ambiguity about what was happening. Another board member, a woman whose family had deep roots in the state, raised a different concern. "I understand the historical significance, but is it appropriate for us to single out one family, one officer, when this was clearly a widespread practice? Are we not unfairly scapegoating Captain Hargrave?" Renee had anticipated this question. "We are not singling out Captain Hargrave," she said. "We are using this photograph as a window into a system. The point is not to vilify one man. The point is to show how ordinary people, people who considered themselves respectable, participated in extraordinary cruelty. That is what makes this image so powerful. It looks like a routine portrait, but when you know what those fibers mean, you can never see it the same way again." The discussion continued for nearly 2 hours. Some board members were supportive. Others were concerned about backlash, about donor relations, about the university's reputation in a state where Confederate heritage remained a sensitive topic. One member suggested a compromise. The photograph could be included in a broader exhibition about Civil War-era Mississippi without focusing specifically on slave catching. Another suggested delaying any public presentation until after a major fundraising campaign had concluded. In the end, Dr. Simmons called for a vote. The board approved a modified version of Renee's proposal. The photograph would be the centerpiece of a new exhibition, but the exhibition would be framed as an exploration of hidden histories in Civil War photography with multiple examples and multiple perspectives. The Hargrave family would be contacted before the exhibition opened, and their response, if any, would be included in the interpretive materials. It was not everything Renee had wanted, but it was something. The exhibition opened 8 months later under the title, "What the Camera Saw: Hidden Stories in Civil War Photographs." The Hargrave photograph occupied a central position in the first gallery. Next to it, a panel explained the system of paid slave catching in wartime Mississippi, the role of county officials in coordinating and concealing the practice, and the meaning of the rope fibers visible on the horse's flank. The panel also included the names, not just Elias Hargrave, but the 7 people he had captured and returned in 1862: Sam, Lucy, Daniel, Mary, Jacob, Solomon, Eliza. The archivists had searched for any additional information about these individuals, but the records were sparse. They were listed as property, not as people. Their ages, their families, their fates after they were returned, all of this had been erased from the official record. But one name had yielded something more. Lucy, the woman who had died in transit, had appeared in another document, a letter written by an enslaved woman named Harriet, who had escaped to Union lines in 1863 and later given testimony to a Freedmen's Bureau agent. In her testimony, Harriet mentioned a woman named Lucy, who had tried to escape from a plantation in Yalobusha County in 1862. "They caught her with horses and ropes," Harriet said. "They dragged her back, and she did not live. We buried her in the woods because they would not let us bury her in the ground with the others." The exhibition included a reproduction of this testimony displayed next to the Hargrave photograph. Visitors could read Lucy's story in her community's own words, see the photograph that inadvertently documented her capture, and understand, finally, what "returned" had meant. The response was immediate and divided. Local newspapers covered the exhibition extensively. Some praised the archive for its courage in confronting a painful history. Others accused the university of attacking Confederate heritage and smearing a respected local family. The Hargrave descendants issued a statement expressing deep concern about the exhibition's one-sided interpretation and requesting that their ancestor's portrait be removed. The university declined, but other responses came as well. A woman from Chicago contacted the archive after seeing coverage of the exhibition online. She said her family had oral histories about ancestors who had been enslaved in Yalobusha County. She had always known that one of her great-great-grandmothers had died trying to escape, but she had never known the details. Her name had been Lucy. Renee met with her when she visited the exhibition. They stood together in front of the photograph, the descendant of the enslaved and the archivist who had uncovered the truth. The woman was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "All my life I heard about how our people suffered, but I never had anything to point to. I never had proof. Now I do." She asked if she could have a copy of Harriet's testimony, the words that described Lucy's death and burial. Renee gave her one. The woman held it carefully, as though it were something precious. "This is her grave marker," she said. "This is the only one she ever got." The Hargrave photograph hangs in the archive's permanent collection now. It is one of the most requested images in the Civil War holdings. Teachers use it in classrooms to show students how historical photographs can deceive, how a seemingly ordinary image can contain evidence of extraordinary violence. Scholars cite it in articles about the economics of slave catching and the complicity of local governments in the system of human bondage. But for Renee Caldwell, the photograph remains something more personal. She thinks about it often, about the moment she first noticed those pale fibers under her magnifying lamp. She thinks about how close she came to cataloging it and moving on, how easily the evidence could have been filed away. How many other photographs and how many other archives might contain similar secrets, waiting to be seen? Old photographs are not neutral documents. They were staged, composed, paid for. They show what someone wanted the world to see. But sometimes, despite the photographer's intentions, despite the subject's careful pose, something slips through. A detail that was not meant to be noticed, a trace of what happened just before the shutter clicked. The rope fibers on Captain Hargrave's horse were not supposed to be visible. They were supposed to be cleaned away, forgotten, like the names of the people he had hunted. But they survived. They clung to the animal's flank and were captured in silver and light, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see them for what they were. In textbooks and family albums and museum walls, there are thousands of images like this one. Respectable portraits, proud ancestors, ordinary scenes, and somewhere in each of them, hidden in a reflection or a shadow or a detail no one thought to erase, there may be evidence of the truth, evidence of the people who were owned, hunted, beaten, killed, evidence of the systems that made it possible, evidence that the camera saw, even when no one was supposed to be looking. The work of finding these truths is slow and painstaking. It requires patience, expertise, and a willingness to look at familiar images with new eyes. But it is also a form of justice. Every time a hidden story is uncovered, every time a name is restored, every time a descendant can finally point to proof of what their ancestors endured, something changes. The old lies lose a little of their power. The buried voices grow a little louder. Lucy's name is spoken now in classrooms and lecture halls, in articles and exhibitions. She is no longer just a notation in a ledger, a piece of property returned and lost. She's a person who tried to escape, who was hunted down and killed, who was buried in the woods by people who loved her. She is remembered. And the man who killed her, The man who posed so proudly beside his horse with the evidence still clinging to its flank is remembered too, not as a gallant soldier or a respected citizen, but as what he was, a hunter of human beings, a man who was paid by his county to terrorize, to maim, to kill, a man whose pride in his work was so complete that he did not even bother to wipe the blood from his horse before the photograph was taken. The camera saw it all, and now so do we.